Teju Cole is a writer, photographer, and art historian based in Lagos and New York, where he is a distinguished writer in residence at Bard College. He grew up in Lagos, returning to the US to study art history at Columbia. His works include a novella, Every Day is for the Thief, which apparently is so far only available in Nigeria, though we hope we can fix that, and the Twitter project, Small Fates, which is based on a genre of short news story. However, he is perhaps best known for his novel, Open City, which many of you may have seen. Writing in The New Yorker, the critic James Wood called Open City a brilliant, subtle, and finally original novel. Open City centers on a doctor, half Nigerian and half German, who walks around New York, particularly Morningside Heights, and it describes his encounters with various people in the city. It is characterized by scene changes from museum galleries to apartment and hotel rooms to a detention camp and the former Negro burial ground in Lower Manhattan. Open City was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and winner of the Hemingway Foundation PEN Awards for a distinguished first book of fiction, and has won numerous other awards, including the New York City Book Award for Fiction and the Rosenthal Award for the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I think it's fair to say that the GSD is interested in the way that writing about the city in all its forms helps us to construct ways of thinking about the city, specifically the connection between people and the spaces of the city. There are many references in architecture, including surrealism, where the person wandering is an important catalyst of how the city is viewed. The narrative in Teju Cole's Open City is based on the thoughts of a man who wanders in New York and Brussels. We can learn a lot from writers like Teju and how they observe and describe the world around them. Literature has connotations which suggest it is a particularly high standard form of writing. We are usually very picky over what constitutes a piece of literature. Thus, a text message or an email might not be literature. I suggest that this is not dissimilar to the notion that design is of a particular level of intentionality. Thus, one could say that literature is a form of designed writing in the same way that architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning and urban design are a form of design. In a sense, design and literature have in common issues of research and intentionality, while they're, of course, very different in their aesthetic manifestation. And of course, one of the greatest challenges to designers is in how we describe and write about our own work. We're especially fortunate in having Teju here this evening. It's a really wonderful privilege to have the opportunity to hear the spoken word in addition to his writing and his photography. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you all very much for being here. I know you could be outside getting a suntan. And I'm happy to be here. If things had gone differently yesterday night, I might have emigrated this morning. So, small mercies. Great. It's really wonderful to be in Boston again. And I think what I'd like to do is, well, I have some images I'd like to show you and organize some thoughts around those images, bring in something of my practice as a photographer. But I also want to give you a sense of what I'm doing with my writing. What has been wonderful about getting this unexpected invitation to talk here. Can everybody hear me? I think that needs to be closer. Getting the invitation to speak to architects and designers and urban planners, it's very flattering, but it also sort of forced me to start thinking in a more thematic way about what it is that connects the various my various creative practices. And it's been a very positive experience to do that, because even the struggle to put into words what one is doing can be a very revelatory process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a very short section, less than 5 minutes, from Open City, and then I will give this thing that is not a lecture at all, because those are sort of boring, but more like a sequence of images and a discussion of what I think might be going on with them. And then at the very end, I'll read another short section from Open City, and I hope all of that doesn't take more than 40 minutes. And then afterwards, we can have question and answer, or discussion, or whatever. Open City is a story, as Gary said, about a young man who's wandering around New York. This is in 2006. It's not right after 9/11, but it's in the shadow of that atrocity. And this is a book very much about mourning and about the memory of a place. And just before I start reading, I just want to thank especially Chantel Blakely, who really made this visit happen. The narrator Julius finds himself late at night. He's been wandering aimlessly in the city, and he finds himself, without quite intending to, at ground zero. Atrocity is nothing new, not to humans, not to animals. The difference is that in our time it is uniquely well organized, carried out with pens, train carriages, ledgers, barbed wire, work camps, gas. And this late contribution, the absence of bodies. No bodies were visible except the falling ones. On the day America's ticker stopped, marketable stories of all kinds had thickened around the injured coast of our city, but the depiction of the dead bodies was forbidden. It would have been upsetting to have it otherwise. I moved on with the commuters through the pen. This was not the first erasure on the site. Before the towers had gone up, there had been a bustling network of little streets traversing this part of town. Robinson Street, Lawrence Street, College Place. All of them had been obliterated in the 1960s to make way for the World Trade Center buildings, and all were forgotten now. Gone too was the old Washington Market, the active piers, the fishwives, the Christian Syrian enclave that was established here in the late 1800s. The Syrians, the Lebanese, and other people from the Levant had been pushed across the river to Brooklyn, where they had set down roots on Atlantic Avenue and in Brooklyn Heights. And before that, what Lenape paths lay buried beneath the rubble? The site was a palimpsest, as was all the city, written, erased, rewritten. There had been communities here before Columbus ever set sail, before Verrazano anchored his ships in the Narrows, or the black Portuguese slave trader Esteban Gomez sailed up the Hudson. Human beings had lived here, built homes, and quarreled with their neighbors long before the Dutch ever saw a business opportunity in the rich furs and timber of the island and its calm bay. Generations rushed through the eye of the needle, and I, one of the still legible crowd, entered the subway. I wanted to find the line that connected me to my own part in these stories. Okay, so that's from Open City. And what I sort of want to discuss today, I think of in two sort of broad terms: technologies of the city and memories of the city. And the first refers to this idea that the city is a technology. Outside New York, a high place where with one glance you can take in the houses where 8 million human beings live. The giant city over there is a long flimmery drift, a spiral galaxy seen from the side. I'm not an urban expert, I'm not a city expert, and it certainly feels a bit awkward talking to a room full of experts. My approach to this sort of thing is poetic, it's lyrical, it's from the point of view of somebody who's trying to do creative work in response to the city. One thing I certainly did come to recognize about myself is that my work, in whatever form it is, and I'll present three different kinds tonight: fiction, photography, and the micro stories that I write on my Twitter project. They're very, very different from each other, but what they all have in common is that I do seem to have an obsession with city life and cityness. The city is a technology. In other words, it had to be invented and it had to come about as a solution to certain problems. This is a rendering of an archaeological site, fairly well preserved site in southern Anatolia, called Çatalhöyük. Pardon my pronunciation, any Turks in the room? And this is basically a proto-city. Some people think of it as the first city. It is a settlement that is estimated to have maybe 10,000, up to 10,000 people living in it, mostly built mud brick. What's interesting about this 8th century BCE settlement is that it is a sort of a honeycombed structure, agglutinative construction of houses. There are no streets, there are no paths. This is quite interesting when you think about the fact that streets had to be invented. And at a very early point in the development of the city, there were no streets yet. And so you went up around from roof to roof and descended into the houses from the roofs with ladders. Ladders existed, but no streets. And they sort of lived in there like a beehive, up to 10,000 people. The other thing that's interesting about it is that they do not seem to have been buildings for civic purposes. They were all domestic dwellings, not for religious, not for civic purposes. So, and a lack of hierarchies in those buildings. So these are all things that we sort of had to invent as the city came into its own. Not to find one's way around a city does not mean much, but to lose one's way in a city, as one loses one's way in a forest, requires some schooling. Street names must speak to the urban wanderer like the snapping of dry twigs, and little streets in the heart of the city must reflect the times of day for him as clearly as a mountain valley. The city is a complicated technology that needs to be understood on its own terms. I'm going to say many things tonight for which I have no proof. I move by intuition, but one of my intuitions is that a city is not simply a gathering of many people living in one place. A city is not a hypertrophied version of a village. A city contains, at the risk of tautology, cityness. There is in a city a kind of DNA that, even when you're looking at a very small slice of city, a very small section of the city, it is still imbued with cityness. And I find that very interesting. That down to the level, from the plane, you look down at the city. It's a city, clearly. The streets and the buildings, the particular kinds of buildings, skyscrapers, and a tendency towards grids and all of these later developments in city technology. But the building itself looks like a city building, even in the way that it begins to mimic the grid form of the city itself, so that the integument on the side of a building in a city very often is evoking for us the ground plan of a city. And the ground plan of the building looks like the map of the city. The graveyards, the way we organize our cemeteries, and the way, even down to the way we organize our rooms, the modular approach that we take to putting furniture into places, and our open plan offices, and your lovely beehive that you have here. To me, these are all sort of like expressions down to the very granular level of the cityness of city life. And so, creatively, for me, it becomes something interesting to pursue. How can I find this cityness on the micro scale? Thus, the city repeats its life, identical, shifting up and down on its empty chessboard. The inhabitants repeat the same scenes with actors changed. They repeat the same speeches with variously combined accents. They open alternate mouths in identical yawns. And Calvino is evoking here something that we've sort of all experienced, and we experience more and more, the fact that cities are actually all often talking to each other. What I notice these days to quite a startling degree is because I feel like everything I do is political, and even my photography is political. And to be political is to sort of go on certain campaigns, for example, against photography that you hate. I hate typical ethnic photography. I have murderous intent towards National Geographic, quite often, because of this obsession that they have with the typical, because of this pretense that they engage in of going to India and then pretending that they did not arrive in India by plane, or did not stay in a 5-star hotel in Bombay, but they have to sort of then go out and find the one guy with a turban who, has a beard that he has not cut since the 60s, to represent the typical India, and actually ignore what is startlingly typical, which is that all airports look the same now, and that all hotels look the same, and all cities have Starbucks. And now, whether or not you want to bemoan that is a different issue, but the reality is that we're tending towards the same model. We're all moving in the direction of the huge anonymous megalopolises of southern China. So that interests me, and in my work, in my photographic work, I try to find these sorts of layers that are expressing what I'm referring to as the DNA of the city. It's a little bit of like that Forrest Gump thing, stupid is as stupid does. It's, for me, city is as city does. It's always trying to. You just have to sort of look for it. You have to look for its way of expressing itself or repeating itself, echoing itself in places. This is what I love about photographing the cityscape. This is a sculpture by Seretse on the High Line, which is pretty much a paradigmatic example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, because through this sculpture you can see precisely what it is referencing. But in many other ways as well. This is in Baltimore, and intentionally, advertently, or inadvertently, these echoes keep happening, even to the extent of architectural features seemingly responding to the vanishing point of an urban street. This is in Boston at the new Gardner Museum. And this search for echoes is often leading me to work with reflections and with shadows as well. I should mention that almost all of these are shot with film, just partly because I prefer the color, but also because of the kind of slowness that it forces me into. It forces me to slow down. And then just also sort of the unexpected forms and echoes. This is at JFK Airport, a disused TWA terminal that somehow responded to one of my favorite forms, which is I like what everybody else hates. Okay, I like airports, I like cars, You don't hate buildings. I'm with a captive audience here. You guys like buildings. So. And Calvino liked this idea so much that he repeated it later on in the book. The city is redundant. It repeats itself so that something will stick in the mind. And I find this a very alluring idea. Okay, so I want to get to this second section of this, which is about memories of the city. Forgetting the past is no escape from it. Might be maybe the idea that's at the very center of what I do every time I try to do my work. But also the idea that history is an agony. I'm not sure it's possible to pay significant attention to the history of place and come away with a smile on your face. It's almost as if the history of place is a history of atrocity, the history of submerged atrocity in some way. Which brings me to that peculiar word that occurs in the title of my talk, the palimpsest. A palimpsest basically is a sheet of some kind. In this case, this is parchment. If it's a very fine parchment, you call it vellum, but basically it's an animal skin that is used for writing. But sometimes it could refer to a wax tablet with a wooden backing. And a palimpsest is a surface on which there is writing. Basically, a surface that is used in the manner of an etch-a-sketch, a surface that is used for repeated writing. You write something on it, you erase it, you write something on it, you erase it. Because when what you've written has outlived its usefulness, the backing, the support has not outlived its usefulness. And the support is quite expensive and it's quite difficult to make. And in the case of something like vellum, you can clean it down, you can rub it down with a very healthy mixture of oat bran and milk. It does a vellum good. But it's not actually a very efficient way of cleaning the vellum. It's good enough, and so you can write on it, and what you've written on it is legible. But over millennia, or over centuries, with time, what you rubbed off does not rub off completely and comes back to haunt you, you know. This is the zombie apocalypse you've all been hearing about. The previous text comes back. Well, what's quite interesting with palimpsest, so a palimpsest is basically this kind of support that bears evidence of numerous rewritings. And what's peculiar about them is that they can be very numerous. You can have 6 different texts competing to return to the surface of a piece of vellum. There's a palimpsest, this one now a wax one that was on a wooden support, the wax being mostly gone now. We have on the wooden support evidence of something like, this was found in Russia, of like 100 different texts, which they're crazy enough to try to recover. What we're looking at here is called the Archimedes palimpsest, because one of the texts written on it is by Archimedes. Archimedes did his work in the 3rd century before the Common Era, but this text was written in the 10th century. A mathematical text by one of the fathers of geometry. And as with many works from the ancient world, they survive only in the forms of what has been copied by later scribes. The Archimedes palimpsest is the only source for this particular mathematical text by Archimedes, which is quite remarkable. But unfortunately, what happened was that it was written in the 10th century, and in the 12th century, some devout asshole decided to rub it down and use it as his prayer book. And so when you see that the text that's going from left to right is our unpleasant priest, no, actually, the stuff that is going from bottom to top, you can see that initial letter at the bottom left there. That's the prayer book, and that's much more visible. But from left to right, the Archimedes text comes back. Well, I'm not the first person to think that this is an amazing metaphor for so many things, you know. The palimpsest is something that now lends itself very easily to metaphor. I wonder if it's one of those things that the metaphorical usage of it has actually overtaken the literal usage. Except that your iPad remembers everything. Everything. And so this idea has been such a powerful one for, not just for my writing, which is very much concerned to have its various layers showing through, have the experience of space be one of submerged layers, but very much my photography as well. In several different ways, which I'm just going to sort of scroll through. One way is in the most direct way possible, which is in terms of sort of writing and layers. I'm very drawn to graffiti, like Walker Evans and Friedlander. I'm very drawn to marks and signs. In this case, some plexiglass at a subway station overlooking a street in Queens sort of gives a straightforward feeling for the layering of space. But another practice I engage in is to use slow shutter speeds to create a kind of displacement, to create sort of ghostly presences. This was interesting for me to do here because this was in Wall Street, which is one of the most historically heavy spaces for me in Lower Manhattan. Many of you have probably heard of the Situationists in France in the 50s and 60s. One of their leaders, Guy Debord, wrote about something called the dérive, which is almost like an elaboration on the idea of being a flaneur. Being a flaneur somehow entails wandering around and taking in the city in a footloose sort of way. The dérive was more about absorbing the spiritual intensities, the psychological intensities of particular spaces in the city. It's seemingly random, but actually it's more about openness to those places in the city that are vortices of energy. I know it all sounds very sort of mystical, but in the research I was doing for Open City, I found that in a way it was kind of true. There's certain places in the city that just kind of like sort of draw you to, and then you're like, why is this place bothering me? You go home and do some research and you find out 20,000 people are buried under your feet, so that sort of thing. And Wall Street is certainly one of those contested and troubled places. So using slow shutter speeds became a way of doing that. And similar thing with this image of, this ghostly image of the Brooklyn Bridge, which for me immediately evokes two sorts of events. One is an actual event that I witnessed, then I later transposed to another part of the city in my novel. But I was out walking at like across the bridge at 6 a.m. one morning, as we all do, and I witnessed the aftermath of an accident right around that spot, and the people were sitting there. They were sort of bleeding, and they were looking kind of sort of confused, and there was broken glass everywhere, and the emergency services were kind of just arriving. So for me, that space is always loaded with the fact that this thing happened here, and very few other people witnessed it. And also, just the simple fact that in the building of the bridge, dozens of people died. And so those losses are always sort of present in a way in those structures, structures that are their own memorials. And the same sort of thing is happening here, which is in the city of Margao in India, in the state of Goa. I want the story to have its own. I don't know. There was some flow with my film, but I like it. I like that blue line. I want a story that seems to. I want a photo that seems to be in possession of some story that we're not completely aware of. And in this particular case, there actually is a story there because I was standing outside the house of a relative who had died a couple of months before. And for me, this photograph just captures everything about the event of visiting his widow. Another strategy that I have been consciously pursuing with the photographs has been simply the layering of different historical epochs. So I like I was sort of waiting out there for this time of day to come, but I very much like the motorcyclist and the Renaissance statue. This is in Florence, Italy. It's actually 2 weeks ago, this photo. Or in the case of something like this in Norwich, England, the new Millennium Library layered against St. Peter Mancroft Church, which is a church from I think from the 14th century. And in it is buried Sir Thomas Browne, one of my great heroes, the 17th century English physician and writer. And Thomas Browne had actually a very interesting idea in, I think it was in Urn Burial, but I can't be sure, in one of his essays anyway, about what light does. He has a resonant phrase that light reveals some things, it illuminates some things, but there are other things that are concealed in the presence of light. And I like this very much. And he gives the example that the presence of light makes the stars invisible, and only in darkness can we see the stars. And I sort of like that idea because now I'm always thinking about what is the, and then this leads me to yet another strategy. What is the role of dark spaces? What role is black playing in a picture plane or in a piece of writing? Or for you architects, what role is a shadowed area playing in one's conception of a building? It gives you, all hail to the glass house, right? But areas of shadow give you something to work yourself off against. This is a photo I took in Sao Paulo, and I'm very pleased with it because of those areas of darkness, but also because I took this photo a day after I found this quote. The dark, far from representing a total absence, remains in our photographs like information at rest. Companhia de Foto is a photographic collective from Brazil, and it was just one of those really satisfying events that the next day I was able to go out and do this photo of which that is true. But this for me is maybe of all the ideas I have been working with this year, this is the one that has just sort of really stuck with me, and it seems to be invading all areas of my life. The idea that the dark represents information at rest. Information is always there, if you know how to pull it out. You will be very surprised to hear that one of my favorite movies is Alfonso Cuarón's Y tu mamá también, from, who likes that movie? From 2001, I think it was. A sexy film about two young, privileged Mexican boys having the summer of their lives, but enriched unexpectedly by voiceovers that you might not even notice the first time you watch the film, If they had driven by the same spot 10 years ago, they would have noticed first a few white feathers and then a few overturned crates and then a truck on its side and the dead bodies of it. And it was this idea that actually sort of set me off going. When I saw this film, I guess it was in 2001 I saw it, on this wild goose chase that has now sort of completely absorbed my thinking, which is that spaces actually retain the memory of the things that happened in them. I don't think this is what gave me the idea, but it certainly was a kind of confirmation that this is something that can be productively pursued. In the film, they treat it with a very light touch. It actually happens in only 2 places. As they're driving along, Marcelino Escutia, a bricklayer from Michoacan. In this case, it's not something that happened in the distant past. It is something that they sort of have a rough time in traffic and they see there's been an accident. And the voiceover just sort of comes in and gives us a little capsule history of this guy who has just been, I think he just got killed or badly injured in this accident. He's an immigrant. This is his family, blah, blah, blah. And then we move on and we go back to our merry protagonists onto the adventure. But it was just this, it's exactly this sort of inclusion of the weightier parts of existence into the everyday that became so interesting to me. Which leads me to, so I've talked about the fiction and the photography, and then so this sort of leads me to that third aspect of my work that I suggested before. This is a photo of a French art historian and anarchist, 2 things that go very well together, dandy, called Félix Fénéon, who in 1906 wrote Faits divers for Le Matin, and he wrote them very, very well indeed. Raoul G. of Ivry, an untactful husband, came home unexpectedly and stuck his blade in his wife, who was frolicking in the arms of a friend. In Oyonnax, Mademoiselle Côté, 18, threw acid in the face of Monsieur Bernard, 25. Love, obviously. As I started to do research for my new book, which is a non-fictional narrative of Lagos, Nigeria, the city I grew up in, I'm just so completely in love with this form. And I have a Twitter project where at this point, I have written thousands of these because I write them every day and I've been doing it for more than a year and I write several each day. I basically sort of score the Nigerian newspapers for stories of mayhem and disaster and tragedy. And I recompose them into the form of what I call small fates. It's kind of a slight pun on fait divers. But for me, it becomes a way to present Nigerian modernity to, thousands of people who might not know anything about Nigeria at all. So, Madame, the car has been stolen, Amazia, a driver in Lagos, said correctly, as he had stolen it himself with a duplicated key. And in addition to this sort of fleet and sort of very fast little yo-yo of irony that we encounter in these stories, because some of them are very sad. In Ikotu, Mrs. Ojo, who was terrified of armed robbers, died in her barricaded home of smoke inhalation. I'm certainly interested in the ways in which what we would wish for ourselves do not necessarily, they don't turn out that way. We're always under the gaze of irony. But I then become also interested in the city as a space for terrible things happening to people, but importantly, terrible things that are then instantaneously forgotten. Excuse me just a second. Let's check something on this note here. There's something I'm leaving out. Just a minute, please. These two photos are from, I wish they were mine. They're from a Mexican photographer who was basically a photographer of the tabloids. He's still alive now. He's no longer active. His name is Enrique Metinides. And he was a kind of Mexican Ouija. He would show up, he would be on the police scanners. He started when he was 10 years old. He'll be on the police scanners, and he'll be the first person to get to a site of some mayhem, of some disaster. And he would create these, I mean, there's a robbery in progress here. Put himself in these extremely dangerous situations. His images are full of dead bodies and crashes. But of course, what is interesting is that other than his photograph, by tomorrow, the event is gone. The event vanishes. It's always the worst day of somebody's life, but then the event vanishes unless, as James Salter writes in another context, what you don't write down vanishes. If you write it down, it remains, even if you remember it incorrectly. So then that becomes, these zones of sort of danger become a kind of interest for me as well. So this photograph, which I took in Lagos, sort of has sort of all, what I now think of as the hallmarks of what interests me in photography, the shapes and the layering and all of this stuff. But you can't help but worry about that man who does not seem to be, shall we say, formally employed by the electrical services. He looks as if he's about to earn himself a small fate. Okay, winding down here. Yet another thing that because basically this is a problem that I'm trying to attack from many different sides. How do you make a piece of writing? How do you make a photograph tell about more than the present? How do you move an image beyond illustration? This is Rome, and this is New York City. So something I have been practicing a lot has been, and in fact, I'm preparing an exhibition on this particular theme, pairing images that I've taken in different places that are somehow speaking to each other. To go back again to Calvino's idea that the ideal city is actually a city that is made up of many different parts of many different cities. I photograph obsessively. I start to find images that are actually speaking to each other without my permission. And so formally, then I print them out and frame them and put them next to each other for the productive ironies that might emerge. And then finally, the image to which we come with some external knowledge of what it refers to, of what its referent is. And that is the case with this photograph of people looking out onto ground zero. And so the power of that image, for the most part, comes, well, not just from the layering of it and what they're doing, but now the knowledge of what they're looking out at. And I'm just going to end with a brief passage from the book. So as soon as I find it. Most of the book happens in New York, but Julius goes to Brussels briefly in search of his grandmother. And then he's coming back. These thoughts had returned even before I was properly back in the city. The pilot's voice crackling through the system. We're now making our final approach for landing, added to the anxiety of return, because those ordinary and by now banal words seemed to carry some ghostly portent. My thoughts quickly became entangled with one another, so that in addition to the usual morbid thoughts one normally has on a plane, I was saddled with strange mental transpositions, that the plane was a coffin, that the city below was a vast graveyard with white marble and stone blocks of various heights and sizes, But as we broke through the last layer of clouds and the city in its true form suddenly appeared 1,000 feet below us, the impression I had was not at all morbid. What I experienced was the unsettling feeling that I had had precisely this view of the city before, accompanied by the equally strong feeling that it had not been from the point of view of a plane. Then it came to me. I was remembering something I had seen about a year earlier. The sprawling scale model of the city that was kept at the Queen's Museum of Art. The model had been built for the World's Fair in 1964 at great cost, and afterward had been periodically updated to keep up with the changing topography and built environment of the city. It showed in impressive detail, with almost 1 million tiny buildings, and with bridges, parks, rivers, and architectural landmarks, the true form of the city. The attention to detail was so meticulous that one could not help but think of the cartographers in the story by Borges, who, obsessed with accuracy, had made a map so large and so finely detailed that it matched the empire's scale on a ratio of 1:1. A map in which each thing coincided with its spot on the map. It proved so unwieldy that it was eventually folded up and left to rot in the desert. Our view from the plane, as we banked over Queens itself, brought all that back to mind. And in this case, it was the real city that seemed to be matching, point for point, my memory of the model, which I had stared at for a long time from a ramp in the museum. Even the raking evening light falling across the city evoked the spotlighting used for the panorama. On the day I had been to the Queen's Museum, I had been impressed by the many fine details it presented. The rivulets of roads snaking across a velvety Central Park, the boomerang of the Bronx curving up to the north, the elegant beige spire of the Empire State Building, the white tablets of the Brooklyn piers, and the pair of gray blocks on the southern tip of Manhattan, each about a foot high, representing the persistence in the model of the World Trade Center towers, which in reality had already been destroyed. I think I'll stop there. Thank you all very much. Thank you. And I think, yes.
So where do we start? I think is that working? Yeah. So I think one of the critiques that is often made of us as designers, that maybe we don't understand the city enough or well enough. We're maybe too quick to propose solutions. And one of the thoughts that came to me from your presentation, this is before we open up for your questions, but one of the thoughts that occurred to me from your presentation was, and without intruding too much in your intuition and in your kind of creative process, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your methodology, your research for your book, but also for your photography. Yeah. Because I think we can learn a lot from that in terms of your very nuanced observations of what you call city life.
I thank you. I as somebody who was / is involved with the academy, I'm fine, thank you. I'm very interested in this question of, because I have a bit of training as a historian of art. I really wonder what the role of unsystematic history should be in the academy, because that's the only kind that interests me. Is it something that we can find a way, a place for intuitive experience of place that is grounded in fact, but is not systematic? Because I think this is something that is actually closer to our experience of space. Nobody actually sits down and reads one of Kenneth Jackson's books about New York from cover to cover. And they're marvelous, but you don't. I mean, and even things that are less encyclopedic and less comprehensive than that. Because the fact of the matter is that we only walk down one street at a time, and we sort of do it in a sort of a footloose way. And so my writing and my photography basically comes from walking, from getting lost. When I was writing this book in particular, because I wanted it to be very close to the feeling of experience, I actually did order like a stack of books about New York and New York history. And now that I finished the book, I find them very fascinating. I didn't use them at all because, that was not the tone, that was not the language I wanted. That was not the density of experience I wanted to evoke. I wanted the texture of the text to be, texture of the text, see what I did there? To be like that of what somebody's mind might be doing. And so there was an element of sort of like tying my hands behind my back and not doing the research I really ought to do, just so that I could have spaces, so that I could have areas of darkness in there, so that I could have, and there are many places in the book where Julius would say, I forget, and so there are places where he has total recall about certain things, and there are certain places where he's just uncertain. And the problem with systematic history is that the historian knows it all. And we've all met historians. They actually don't. They finish writing that book and they forget it all. So anyway, long-winded answer to your question. I try to keep a sort of a balance between having it be factual and deep, but at the same time keeping it loose enough that it's not estranged from our experience as persons.
Okay. Could you tell us also, just before, because I want to take some questions, but could you maybe also speak a little bit about the difference between city life and urbanism? How, because you emphasized city life and cityness, and how is that different, or is it different?
I don't know that it is. I mean, I don't know that avoidal isms. I don't know that urbanism is a word that shows up a lot in my idiolect. One word I do use a lot is urbanating, which is a word used only by two people on the planet Earth, myself and one of my best friends. It's just our word for going on a long, aimless walk in the city. What's up with you? No, nothing. I'm just urbanating, So we go urbanating, and then since I wrote the book, sometimes we call it doing a Julius.
Okay.
Urbanating is when you head out and you spend 3 hours just, not solving a problem, just walking.
Okay.
But but I guess urbanism and city life are probably, pretty close. As a writer, I prefer the simpler expression, city life.
And urbanating.
Yeah.
Okay. So do we have questions? Come on. There. Hey.
I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are about nature in cities. I
hate nature. Culture always. No. Down with nature. 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 What can I say about nature? Nature is my mother, my father. The city I'm writing about at the moment, Lagos, one of its its most heartbreaking tragedies is that it's actually a space from which nature has more or less been banished, right? So not even the fantasy of country life that is a place like Central Park. It's not really nature, but close enough for city slickers. When you actually live years in a city that does not have the green spaces, that does not have these spaces to breathe, I might be wrong about this, but I think Bombay is another city that has that kind of problem. I think it takes a toll on people, Yeah. But just going with your question, I find that the forms, I do like going for a hike, I go to the Adirondacks and all that, but the form of nature I actually enjoy the most is the city park. If it's a big one, the Tiergarten in Berlin, for example, actually feels a little bit wild, It's my favorite kind because then I know I can step out of it when I'm done and go to an art gallery, But it's important to have it there. And places that don't have it, Rem Koolhaas more than a decade ago suggested that cities like Lagos and cities like the new Chinese cities, where that's where humanity is going, and I think if that's the case, that's sort of like a terrible shame, because the older cities that have actually made the space for lungs and for bodies of water and all of that. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, they're better places to live. So I think it's extremely important, but not too much nature, Okay. That it's not good for your mind either.
I was just interested to hear your reaction to Abuja as a city and whether Julius could live in Abuja.
Abuja.
Yeah.
Well, I've not spent a lot of time in there, but I've been there a few times. Abuja is basically Nigeria's Brasilia. It's a city invented in the middle of the country as a capital that is more centralized and takes away the heat from the bigger cities. And it is, on the one hand, one of the most efficient of Nigerian cities, which is not saying much. It is a pretty sterile place. It is kind of thick. I mean, if we're talking about spaces having psychic energies, Abuja is thick with corruption and erasure. It is a kind of like quasi-Dubai-like space. Nothing quite so glittery, but moving in that direction. But it is... The poet Les Murray has a wonderful line in one of his poems. It says, "We are money's genitals." Which is quite interesting, right? Because we are what money uses to fuck other people over, rather than the other way around. And there is something similarly concentrated and genital about a space like Abuja that it doesn't feel like a cultural space. It exists for government, and if you're talking about Nigeria, government means money. So whenever you go to Abuja, somebody will joke to you and says, "Oh, make sure you come back with a contract." Not really a nice city, but it's a city. I accept them all, as a father does all his children. Yeah.
You started your piece with just beautiful references to immigrants who used to live downtown, Syrians and so forth.
That's
and
right.
So I wonder if you could talk about race, ethnicity, immigration in the city, in particular with a city like New York, how you see and understand city change in terms of, we call it here gentrification, displacement, how you see bodies moving in and out of cities or being pushed in and out of cities, and the concept, just your insights. Thank you.
I mean, just to even stretch that question, to the historical perspective that you evoke at the very beginning of the question, which is that in a space like what is now Ground Zero and the Battery Tunnel, it was when they started digging for the Battery Tunnel in the 40s that they kicked out all the Lebanese and the Syrians. That place was the Middle Eastern section of town. I mean, funny enough, right? So these are sort of like the embedded histories of space, because that last photo I took it precisely at the time when there were people in that very space holding a protest saying you can't build a mosque here, it's sacred ground. And it becomes a question of, sort of sacred to whom? Because then the Battery Tunnel thing happened, and then in the World Trade Center was built the towers went up in 77, I think they were finished. But the building basically started in the 60s. And there was this obliteration of the streets that had been there as well. There was even a petition by 325 business owners saying, you can't just chuck us out, So there's this, which puts us into a kind of complicated mourning for the World Trade Center, because it's precisely this point that nothing is ever the first erasure on any site, A problem like gentrification is like sort of like the modern form of saying, hey, we're going to make your neighborhood better, so good that you can't live in it, But before all of that, you just have the fundamental problem of what do you do with a city which, after all, is all about as many people that is part of the efficiency of the city, as many of us as possible in one space, so that we can use less water, less space, less resources. We can be more creative, we can be more innovative. The city is humanity's greatest invention, probably. But it also means that, we're always treading on the dead. So what is it that makes, 2800 at Ground Zero, sacred ground, and you go 4 blocks that way, and you've got 20,000 slaves over here, and you've got a grocery store, and you've got an FBI place, and you've got a diner, you've got a strip club, that's not sacred ground. And, one of the grim lessons of history is that what is and is not sacred ground, in addition to how the proximity in time to us, can also just simply be a question of who's making a fuss, because you're not about to clear out whatever it is, 10 acres of prime real estate in Lower Manhattan just because somebody thinks their ancestors are buried there. History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake.
We have a question here.
Got the mic.
All right.
We talk in design a lot about placemaking, but from what you were saying, it seems like places make themselves through the overlay of memories. So what should we design for, or how can we frame what you find fascinating about the city?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite sure I don't have any, strong insight into that, because I think any responsible approach to place has to have a kind of healthy balance between innovation and preservation. And this is the kind of tension. And when we see those spaces that have gone in either extreme, they're always unpleasant, I mean, nobody really wants to live in Abu Dhabi, But on the other hand, being in a place like Venice or Florence is really weird, It's like preserved to a fault. And you can't fart without a permit. So it is this kind of balance when you have these cities that are kind of I think Boston, for example, I mean, every city has its major missteps, but this is a place where things are sort of preserved and things are also built. And it's a place like New York, places that architects know that they can still make a contribution. But on the other hand, we also have a sense that, you're not going to tear down the Seagram building, or, you're not going to tear down Penn Station. Oops. But even like the sense of mourning we feel over the fact that the old Penn Station is gone, I think that's at least a good sign that we get it a little bit. So I guess the only answer I'll have to that is that we're always struggling for that balance and struggling for this new way of looking that involves new things, but also the past. I'm very excited about, contemporary architecture of the kind that tries to make sense of the language of other things that have been done. Probably, well, maybe not but probably my two favorite contemporary architects are Piano and Zumthor, and the reason is because of their sense of proportion, actually, which seems to take something from the past in a responsible way. So that if they're doing an extension to an old building, the materials might be completely different, and the skin of the building might be completely different, but they have a sense of the rhythm, rather than busting out with like a sequin shirt and being like, it's a new party, it's all about me. So it's got to be a responsible way of doing it without being like completely beholden to the ugly buildings of the past also, So.
As a photographer and writer, do you see yourself, like, as you move through the city, do you see yourself as an observer or as part of the city? Are you kind of an outsider or part of the fabric of the city?
Well, when I'm working, I'm always trying to be a Martian, try to be an alien, because I think that's the only chance you have to do interesting work, is to try to look at things as if you've never seen them before, Otherwise, I would never have even tried to write a book about New York, because so much has been written about it. What can you say that's new? Well, just have the confidence that what you have to say is worth saying, and that what might at first seem like a totally banal observation, that if you test it and you press it further, might give you an insight, So, the art of describing is actually something I really very much got from my art historical training. You can stand in front of a picture and write 20 pages about it. And most of that is basically you're describing what you're looking at. You describe it so well that the person who can't see the painting has a strong sense of what's going on in there. So when I'm working, I'm trying to describe, either with the camera or with the text, but describe it almost as though my interlocutor were blind. Because I think what a lot of people do when they're describing is, there's this attitude of, well, everybody knows that already, we can skip that bit. But it's the bit that everybody knows that is interesting to me, because that's sort of it's like what they always say about ideology, right? People who say they have none, those are the real motherfuckers. They're the ones who are really out to get you, because they have the heaviest one of all, So when you're describing, just to understand that even the act of description, there's no neutrality, right? So anyway, that's how I get to be so boring.
We have, I think we have time for one more question. Can we?
Yes.
We can take two more.
I'm interested in how you see chance in your personal kind of interactions with places, and in your writing and in your photography. I think the link is quite clear, but this idea that the city is a place where all kinds of collisions, random happenings can occur, and that might be the photographic moment.
That's right.
That might be a plot twist. That might be a sort of revelation for you. So.
I would say chance is everything to me, actually. It's very important. It's very important to me that my photographs are not staged. It's important to me that the stories I write for my Twitter project are the stories I happen to find in the newspaper. I could make them up as, sort of fictions. And even in writing fiction, chance sort of has this terrific role that you're reaching out there, you're sort of trying to find something. For example, those of you who've read the book will know what I mean by this, but at the very end of the book, there's this sort of like this image that has to do with birds dying off in large numbers. And that's basically something I found because I was messing around in a bunch of 19th century newspapers, not really knowing what I was looking for. And I think that's when I'm happiest, when I don't know what I'm looking for, because then you give something a chance to happen to you. And if you're going with too clear an agenda, you're only going to go so far. So the role of chance is it gives you an opportunity to sidestep your own limitations. And then afterwards, then you start curating the chance, even in a way that might look as if it was all planned. Oh yes, I intended that. Anytime anybody asks me a question, yeah, I meant to do that all along. But of course, it's chance.
Okay, I know we need to finish, but could we have? There's one other question.
Yeah.
One more question, and then we're going to invite everyone just to join us for reception behind the curtain. I know it's very dramatic.
I thought I wasn't going to get this question. So I'm really curious about your use of the word small in your project Small Fates. It's very interesting combining those two words, because especially because you're using the Twitter format, you're taking something grand and making it short. But you also talked about this this subversion of the temporality of the event by writing something down. So why smallness?
Well, three quick answers there. One is that I actually like the word small because it's a very plain descriptive, and I tend to favor that kind of adjective anyway. Big, small, dark, red, far, near, keep it so Small Fates. Secondly, because it's a pretty accurate description of the role this kind of stories even play in the newspaper. So, it's here today, it's gone tomorrow. Nobody, the sad fact of it is that when I finally compile these Small Fates into a book, that becomes sort of like the lasting memorial for these poor people who otherwise are not remembered in print anywhere else because the newspapers are gone. So they're small stories. But then I also like the idea that it was a little bit provocative, and I know that there are people out there who are sort of secretly pissed off that I'm saying, how can you call it a small fate? It's a big deal to the person it happened to, which is true, but which is also sort of like the irony. It's like, you're having the worst day of your life, and for the rest of us, it's just a little thing we read in the newspaper. And I like that discomfort. I like that tension. And I contrast it to the sort of the big fates, which I actually find pretty much impossible to write about. I mean, I do write about them. I write these long essays about like political events, and I feel so strident, and I have to go take a shower afterwards. And then I just like look for a little story of disaster, and then I'm fine, But, like if you take a big fate, you're writing about, I don't know, epidemic corruption in Nigeria's oil ministry. I mean, you want to slit your wrists afterwards because, you're just, it's not only is it not going to do any good, it's completely lacking in any kind of beauty or elegance or any redeeming artistic value, and things are just too big to talk about, But if it is like a woman who finds out her husband is cheating and she waits until he's asleep and she slices off his penis, that has such a beauty and an elegance and a satisfaction to it. So, and on that happy note,
thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, thank you.